Great. The recording has started, so thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It's a real pleasure to have Chloe as our guest expert this evening, and thank you all for joining us on an evening session. Always greatly appreciated. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Chloe, who will introduce herself.
Hello, good evening everyone. Hopefully you can see me in a little tab, maybe, if I'm talking. I can't see any of you, it's always so difficult to see you.
Chloe, we can't see you actually.
Oh,
hang on, I might be able to. Maybe it's because I've got so many people open. Hopefully.
yeah, I can see a few people now. Any more
Okay.
thumbs up there? I will stay on camera for the moment anyway, just to say hello and tell you a bit about me, and then I'll go off camera whilst things are being recorded. So I'm Chloe. I've been working in the charity space, predominantly youth and well-being, for the last 20 years or so. All of my roles have involved safeguarding in some capacity or another, whether that's as a trustee, managing cases, or as a director within charities. I've worked for services, national charities such as the Mix, who run predominantly online services for young people, but also anti-bullying organisations, health, wellbeing and employment organisations. So I've done lots of safeguarding, lots of service development, and I currently sit on the National Safeguarding Youth Forum as well as a member of the management committee. So it was through that connection actually that I was asked to run this session on child abuse. There's lots of information in here, hopefully, but there's also lots of opportunity for us to get into smaller groups, have some discussion, have some thinking time, and the option to ask questions as we go and to have a little bit of a dialogue around things. It will be the most impactful, I think, the more you want to participate, engage, and have a bit of an open mind as you're thinking about this theme and the experiences that you have, that you may have had, or things that may present moving forwards. So I'm going to turn off my camera because I'm just looking at an avatar. So I'm going to move on to the aims for today. So this came out in the intro that I sent as well, hopefully, and it's for you all to learn a little bit more about what child-on-child abuse is, and to develop confidence in identifying and responding to any concerns, and also for us to look at how we might action some preventative strategies for the groups that you're leading. Is there anything else? Please come off mute, or please put in the chat that you would like to explore, discuss, or sort of have an answer to, hopefully, today. I'm going to take that as a good silence, that does cover everything. Before I ask this quick question, I did also just want to remind people about the content actually that we're going to be covering today. And if anybody does need to leave at any point during the session or tune out, please do, because we will be talking about some sensitive topics. And also, whilst we are discussing safeguarding, please do bear in mind that this is being recorded, so no specifics, no details, hypotheticals, potentials would be really welcome in the conversations that we're having, but just bear in mind the sensitivity and confidentiality of real life topics. So, a quick question. What I'd love for you to do is, on either a new tab screen on your device, or open up your mobile phone and go to www.menti.com. So that's MENTI.com. Let me see if I can put this in the chat as well.
I've just popped it in there for you.
You did. And then when you get to that page, if you enter in this code for me. What you should then get is this question. Do you think there has or could be child-on-child abuse happening in your groups? And in theory, this should update in real time. Excellent. One person's in there. So we've got 50, 50, likely and yes at the moment. Can't see on this screen how many people have voted, so I'll give you another minute or two. Well, another minute. So we think it's quite likely. Some people think definitively yes. There will be one more of these, so if you've had any issues, please do pop in the chat. Between myself and Grace, we'll hopefully be able to sort it, because there'll be one more in a sec. Okay. So this is quite reassuring to me, for us to be this end of the spectrum, and hopefully that will become more clear as we go, why it feels positive that we're that end of the spectrum. So we're going to explore a little bit about what child-on-child abuse is. And before I give you amalgamated lists of things, what I would love to do again is for you to go back to Menti and tell me the types of things you think about when you hear the term child-on-child abuse. So that's the code for the new Menti. And what we should get, hopefully, please shout if you can't, hopefully you'll see this screen now with the question, what do you think about when we say child-on-child abuse? Go to Menti and this code. Pop in words, phrases, organisations, questions, anything you think about when we say that. With many of you thinking it's likely to be happening or is happening within your groups, what do you think is present? What do you think is happening? So our first one on the screen, ignoring personal space, bullying, pressure for sex. So sexting, sexual harassment, strong sort of, yeah, sexual theme happening there. Different ages. It's a great phrase to see up there. Unintentional racism. I would assume by the unintentional racism being up there that we would consider intentional as well, but perhaps that being thought of less readily. Oh, and we've got Twitter up there, so a platform as well. Something that you think about when we think about child-on-child abuse is a platform. And actually, I will mention a couple. It's not Twitter, but there are a couple where sharing of sexual images are more likely to happen. Exploitation. So there's a bit around relationships in there. Quite a strong theme around sexual abuse in the broadest sense, whether that's harassment, harm, and bullying has obviously come up more than once, which is why that's bigger than any of the other words there. Not listened to. Yeah. So you can keep adding to these. I will leave this with Grace, and you'll be able to hold on to that. So hopefully we're back to the slide presentations that you can see now. And this is the list that is sort of aggregated from Keeping Children Safe in Education, which is the guidance set out for the education sector on how they must implement safeguarding, which is much more defined, much more rigorous than across the broader youth sector. We tend to take some guidance from KISS, it can be called, and Working Together to Safeguard Children. So this is a list from Keeping Children Safe in Education, and the Met Police actually is this list. And there are things that are used to help define these things, and it can be one-off or repeated, on or offline, and it's often referred to as intentional. And you see that a lot in some of the literature, but I think personally I would challenge that. And interestingly, we saw unintentional racism up on the last, in the word cloud as well. So bullying came up, relationships and the abuse that happens within relationships, which perhaps speaks to coercive control as well, which is at the bottom. You have your categories of abuse in the broadest sense that we might think about: physical, sexual, emotional, financial is there as well. It's below my taskbar, but I'm sure that's what's on there. Upskirting, sharing of images, that certainly came up on there, on the word cloud, and initiation and hazing type activities, things that are about humiliation or may have an inbuilt element of abuse. Are there any surprises there for people, or anything somebody immediately thinks is missing? I don't see anything necessarily missing from the word cloud, but please do pop into the chat or come off mute if you are surprised by something or think something might be missing. Fab. No surprises. So these behaviours are things that have been around for a long time, and it makes, whilst there has been a change in term, which I'll come to, the first sort of incident that sticks out in my mind is the Jamie Bulger case, which was back in 1993, of two children who took another child to, I think it was a railway track, and there were incidences of child-on-child abuse there, and actually resulted in the end in the death of a child. And so these behaviours, whilst they may have morphed and changed, and there is more online abuse that happens now, it's been around for a long time. It's considered a type of behaviour that, whilst it's harmful for the victim or survivor, depending on the type of language that you choose. It is widely considered that any child-on-child abuse is also harmful for the person perpetrating it as well, and that those that harm others, children or young people that harm others, may well have additional or complex needs and may have experienced things in their own life that we, whether it's sort of witnessing domestic abuse or experiencing these things themselves, that is implicit in this definition that makes us want to pay attention to the child or the young person who is exhibiting these sorts of behaviours as well. There's been a lot more talk about child-on-child abuse recently. So whilst it's an old behaviour, more conversation, and that really seemed to pick up momentum for me, happy to hear other people's thoughts on it, when the website Everyone's Invited popped up. They define themselves as an anti-rape movement organisation, challenging and exposing rape culture. And in June 2020, the founder shared her own experiences of rape culture. And this was predominantly within school settings or school environments, or within the context of schools, whether it's on school trips or camps. And after the founder posted her account in June 2020, 50,000 anonymous cases were also published. And there were accounts of sexual violence, of normalization of rape culture, lack of action or agency around tackling it. And it resulted in Ofsted paying more attention and publishing a report in April of 2021, so about 10 months later, that resulted in changes to the statutory guidance for the education system, the Keeping Children Safe in Education, that came into play September of this year. And within that, the term which did exist before, which was talked about, was peer-on-peer abuse. And that was changed to child-on-child abuse. And I would speak to the phrase different ages that came up in the word cloud, because the reason for this changing is that peer-on-peer made people think about two 15-year-olds or 14 and 15-year-olds, whereas actually we are talking about two people who are under the age of 18, and there can be a much bigger age gap between perpetrator and victim, and that being a perpetrator who may be younger than the victim, who may be older as well. But this movement, the movement around Everyone's Invited and the loudness that it created increased the awareness of it being an area of abuse that children were experiencing that wasn't being tackled well enough, or it wasn't being given the right importance. Could be lots of other reasons, and we'll actually discuss barriers in a little bit, but it really brought it into the spotlight. And if we were to look at prevalence of the types of abuse that we're talking about, there is no one statistic around the prevalence of child abuse, like there is perhaps sort of sexual abuse of adults on children, because of all the different things that it covers. But if we were to start thinking about how likely it is that this is happening, we can start with bullying and the fact that 44% of young people say that they were bullied within the last 12 months, and that's the Anti-Bullying Alliance statistic. And there is suggestion that bullying has been talked about to be the leading cause in death for children, and with prevalence so high, it's an alarming correlation between the two. The Everyone's Invited website cites police figures. I haven't fact checked this, so I've put the cited reference in there that says 1 child is raped in school on every school day. And in primary schools alone, 3 sexual assaults are reported to the police. And I think we know the general narrative around sexual harm is that it perhaps goes under-reported than over-reported. Sexual abuse online being normalised in schools and amongst children, and 9 out of 10 girls have said that they've received unsolicited images or sexist name calling, and that's through the Ofsted report itself. Sexting is, there is a higher prevalence the older the age group, and it accelerates quickly. But sexting happens more amongst some groups, such as those that are in care as well. And the places that it's most likely to happen are WhatsApp and Snapchat. And I would challenge you to give me a handful of names of children that are not already on Snapchat or WhatsApp, and therefore what that might mean for these sort of prevalence statistics. And there are 2 groups. I mentioned that sexting happens more amongst those that are in care, and that's from the Internet Matters report, and there are some other interesting statistics in there. But there are a couple of groups that are more likely to experience child-on-child abuse, and that's those with special educational needs and disabilities, 3 times more likely to be abused than their peers, and those that identify as LGBTQIA+ or are struggling with their mental health. They are more at risk. So before we move on to how it might have been showing up, I wonder if there are any, I can come back on camera, and if people talk, maybe we can have a bit of a conversation, but are there any immediate reflections or thoughts, questions about what it is and prevalence? No?
Hi. Well, one of the big changes for this generation is the access to the web is online, anything online, access to images and ideas and each other and strangers, and a lot more than kids did in any previous generation. I wondered if that might have an impact.
It's an interesting one, and I think there is something in what that looks like being different. And certainly through my anti-bullying work, we used to have a lot of conversation around bullying used to happen within the school environment, and at least children could get away from it. But now it can be 24/7, which can double down on the impact and the severity of what somebody might experience. I think whilst there are some things to consider in that, my view is always to consider how we equip children and young people to navigate and stay safe in their worlds. And their worlds are online and offline, and that's not going to change. And therefore, I challenge us to try and catch up. And I say try because I count myself in that. Try and catch up with the different platforms and the different technology and what's available, and to help put appropriate controls in place depending on age, etc. But to educate ourselves in doing that, and to have conversations with young people about how to keep themselves safe. Just like we have conversations about crossing the road and not going off with strangers in real life, but about doing that in an online space as well. And the education and conversation and dialogue is perhaps, for me, the more powerful element than the medium or the platform at which it might happen. So I'm getting some direct messages here. So I don't know, Grace, if it's okay with you if we unlock the chat for everybody. So I don't know if people can see my chat box now with screen sharing. But
I can't see yours, Chloe. I've only had some direct messages from some people, but no one to the overall group. I will just have to try and figure that out a moment.
Yeah, so I've got direct messages as well. So I wonder if it's the fact that the rooms perhaps put, yeah, some Denny just said we can't message the group. That might be something about permissions there. So I'll just read this. There's worrying to see such high percentages of abuse online. There was a question around, does it happen to boys? Not sure which that was, what that was directly related to. Some more feedback around the statistics, particularly about rape, and the figures are likely to be higher. Absolutely. So we'll have a look, see if we can unlock the chat room, but I'm going to ask Grace to help me because I don't seem to have permissions. We're going to go into sort of just in pairs, maybe, if that's possible, Grace, just randomized pairs, and for you to start having a conversation about where, when, or how child-on-child abuse might have been showing up, where you might have already seen or experienced it, or perhaps even moments that you didn't quite identify as perhaps child-on-child abuse as we've been talking now. So to discuss how it might have been showing up and give you about just 5 minutes to start that conversation.
Perfect. I will pop everyone in breakout rooms randomized now. Okay.
Thank you.
Chloe, it's just you and I think, out here. Do you want me to pop you into a room?
No, I'll be all right staying here, thank you.
Perfect. I'm just going to try and figure out the chat.
Yeah. Show chat, I wondered if...
Shirley, you don't seem to have been assigned, so I'm just going to pop you into a room.
I seem to have popped in and popped straight back out.
That's okay. Let me pop you in again. 1 moment.
Participants can share the chat with everyone. I might have done it. If you can hear me, Grace.
Yes, I can. Shirley, I've tried to assign you to room 4, but it hasn't popped you through. Oh, she's in room 3. Excellent.
Yep, I can see she's in there. Debs is the only one that hasn't joined. Oh, Debs.
Oh, Shirley, you're
Sorry. It's not letting me stay in anywhere.
I'm just wondering why. Let me have a look. I'm going to try and re-add you again, Shirley, but apart from doing what I'm doing, I'm not sure why it's not doing that. 1 minute.
No problem, thanks.
I'm so sorry, Shirley. It doesn't seem to like us putting you into a group.
No, don't worry about it. It doesn't. I don't know if it's my device or.
So to give you context, everyone else has got a little green dot next to their name, I guess sort of maybe showing they're active in some way, and yours is grey. So that's the only thing I can tell you, unfortunately. All right, hang tight. Everyone will be out in a couple of minutes.
No problem.
Is there anything else let me put my camera on so you can see me too, Shirley. And anything you'd like to talk about, Shirley? We can always talk in the main room.
I'd be interested to know how the figures have changed, really, I suppose. When you're a kid in school, you don't really know at the time. Sometimes you look back and think, oh, maybe. But I didn't really know of what was going on in that regard around me, I guess. It'd be interesting to know if the figures have changed awfully.
In any particular area or across the board, do you think?
What do you mean? Sorry?
So which figures are you wondering would have changed? Is it a particular area?
No, about bullying, about the sexual violence, although the sexual harassment, sexual violence, and the bullying. Has bullying changed any, or is it just that we're picking up on it more because if it's happening through a device? I mean, in some ways, I think a lot of kids sometimes don't even recognize that they're being bullied, sometimes, or don't name it that way. But I'm just curious to know whether I mean, basically, has our human behavior changed over time, or are we just recording it more fully now?
Yeah, see, my instinct says that our behavior hasn't really changed.
Right, that would be my instinct as well.
Yeah, and that there is something in that it used to happen in the 7 hours of school time, and now it can happen across a 24-hour window. I think there is probably something in that, but the behavior itself isn't something that has significantly shifted.
The breakout rooms are closing now, so I think everyone will be coming back in.
Yeah. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I think that's everyone back in. So I think we've fixed the group chat as well. If somebody wants to test it for us. Thank you, Jenny. That looks like yes. So please feel free to put things in the group chat. We can now all see any thoughts from your group chats. I'm going to move on to sort of recognizing and responding and prevention, but any thoughts or comments? No? Then we'll keep going. Come on, slides. Ta-da, responding well. So responding, we will look at different types of outcomes there might be. But actually, some of this is about once you've acknowledged its existence, which by all accounts, the poll at the start meant you were all quite open to the fact that this is probably happening, has happened, will be present, has been present within your groups. So once you know that could exist, you know what you're looking for. So you added to the word cloud. We've had a look at the list as it might be defined. And you know what you are looking to spot. Then those signs, symptoms, if you like, of abuse are the same here as they would be for any other type of abuse. It could be somebody acting out, it could be somebody being withdrawn. The long list that you perhaps do in typical safeguarding training also exists here, because ultimately we're talking about a young person, a child who's experienced abuse. And then to challenge it. And that means, which we'll explore a bit more in prevention, but that means having conversation, having an acceptable set of behaviours that are clear to the group, to the children, young people in the groups you're working with. And if those behaviours are not upheld, then the boundaries are reinforced. And it's not an area that I actually intended on spending too much time today, because you are all leaders of groups of children, and your youth work and your ability to build relationships and have dialogue, my assumption is that is one of your strongest talents. But it is important to make sure that you use that skill, you hold the boundaries and expectations that you have around behaviour in order to keep those spaces safe. What is really important to make sure we don't do is downplay it. And that was perhaps one of the biggest criticisms when everyone's invited picked up momentum, was the fact that much of the sort of rape culture had a narrative around, oh, boys will be boys, it's all part of growing up, or pinging a bra straps, that's just one of those things that kids do, and it being dismissed. And that setting a tone and a culture that meant that these boundaries could be pushed, and ultimately some of these sexual harassment behaviours or sexual what may have become sexually violent behaviours were being normalised. And when it's not the theory, I'm trying to think of the word, but the position being is that when you normalise some of the harassment behaviours, it gives way to the escalation of behaviours to deliberate sexual harm or sexual abuse. I had put on the last slide and being aware of our own biases, and wanted you to consider that and some of the barriers that might get in the way to recognizing and responding. And when I talk about biases, there may be things in that if you've worked with a group of children for years and you've built relationships, rapport, understanding of them and the family, some consideration about how your relationship with a child could perhaps be a barrier or a bias that might play out in some of that challenging or tackling of inappropriate behaviour. So I'm going to, Grace, if you wouldn't mind.
Yep. Would you like a breakout room?
Yes, please.
Gonna
have a, yeah, just a quick 3 minutes probably. Build on your last conversation about how it's turning up and what might be the barriers to tackling it in your groups.
Bear with me, just trying to get this one going to the same groups again.
Thank you. Is Shirley still with us? Oh no, she's gone into a
I
group this
think
time.
she's there. Yeah.
Made it. So there will be one more breakout group.
Yeah, no problem.
And that can be randomized.
Okay.
A bit around some actions, which new people, new conversation will be fine.
Okay.
Linda's comment in the group chat. Do you remember at what point she popped that in?
I don't, unfortunately. It was 4 minutes ago, though. So my clock off.
I can't remember. Right, going to close the rooms.
Are you doing that, Chloe, or do you want me to?
Sorry, yeah, I've already done it.
Oh, you have. Lovely. Yeah.
That was the easy one for me because it's just a one button, but
Yeah.
for some reason my brain won't multitask. The rooms as well. Welcome back, welcome back. I think everyone's back. Right. So, would anybody like to share anything before I move on to perhaps some of the considerations?
There was a really good point that came up in our discussion about Woodcraft being, as distinct from other youth work organisations, much more likely to have parents involved, even when kids are, into their teens. And sometimes that can be great because we've got a direct line to getting more information. But actually, when those parents are also involved in some way in the running of the group or on the fringes of the group, the complications of trying to resolve or even just discuss potentially very sensitive issues. And maybe that's a particular Woodcraft issue.
Having parents of the children in the same space and having responsibility for running groups.
Yeah, I think that can lead to really difficult tensions, actually. Because you're dealing with, you might be dealing with your friends' friends, and that's really hard. And I think we need somebody much more neutral to see things more clearly. Very difficult when it's your children or your kids' friends involved. One of the things we talked about as well is when kids have friendships and the the things that have happened haven't happened within a camp or within woodcraft. It's just they're an independent friendship, and they might be friends from school or from other environments, and then we get involved, and it's not clear, I think, what our role is there when it's you know, we're not trained as social workers, as Linda was saying. It's a kind of and we're often dealing with very, very delicate situations.
Yeah, and your role is not investigative, but at the same time, if you feel as though a child has and is experiencing abuse, whether that's from another child within your group or in another context, then there is your duty to take some form of action. And that we'd never be able to go through all the different types of situations, but that would be proportionate, sort of within the information that you may have access to, and wouldn't be done just you as a group in a situation like that, where you are spanning, where you are crossing woodcraft lines. Perhaps I would always suggest you're having a conversation with your DSL about it and exploring the best course of action. But that being an essential is that there is at least that conversation that's happening, because there is a child who is experiencing abuse. The one about parents is really interesting, and I think that's about the tone and the culture and the expectation and the agreement, perhaps, that parents are signing up to if they come into these roles within your groups. And it's much harder to challenge and have these conversations without that agreement setting at the offset, at the start. And that may be a change. If it is really challenging, that may be a change that is done through all of the groups, and that's done with quite a bit of noise and consciousness and purposefulness to transition from one way of being to another. That could be quite an active process. So other considerations that may come up, that could be barriers, that could be considerations: the wishes of the victim, the person who's experienced it, and how they might want to proceed, and wanting to give control, empowerment to somebody who may have experienced something horrible, whilst also balancing the needs of a group of other children. And this bringing me back to the point at the start around any child who's abusing another child also having some form of need or support element. But that could be something that enters into the sort of matrix of thinking when responding. The type of allegations, there is perhaps a continuum, if you will. There are legal thresholds to consider versus challenging behaviours which should be addressed, but that may be able to be managed slightly differently and responded to differently. Ages and developmental stages. Power imbalance. So we talked before about those with special educational needs and how that might play into some form of power imbalance between children, as well as something like age. Considerations about response: if it's a one-off, first time, never happened before incident of bullying versus sustained, I was going to say upskirting, but actually that's we're talking about legal thresholds there, but something that has happened over time and how you may respond differently to that. Being aware of how this presents within relationships, and this is becoming much more conscious in general dialogue, from adult relationships to children's relationships, through the justice system, which is trying to catch up, but really what that coercive control and the intimate violence in relationships, what that might look like, and being aware of that. Considering the familial context, ongoing risk, and I guess this is wider context, which I've spoken to already. And then you've mentioned some other things that may factor into your thinking. So responding to and reporting options. Generally, the options for how to respond to something fall into these 4 categories, which again is something that I've taken from Keeping Children Safe in Education, because that's where the most comprehensive guidance really is at the moment for broad safeguarding. So it's either something that can be managed internally. It may require early help, which is some form of proactive intervention, support, whether it's universal or targeted service, to help victim and/or perpetrator. It speaks to a particular activity which is outlined in Working Together to Safeguard Children. But there may be a requirement to report it as a safeguarding or as a child protection incident, and in cases where it is a criminal behaviour, reporting it to the police. And those tend to be the 4, never like talking in absolutes when it comes to safeguarding, but those tend to be the 4 main categories of action that you'll see around any types of child-on-child abuse / abuse, really. And to ensure that when you're deciding what your course of action is, which I've already mentioned, that you aren't shouldering the responsibility for doing that alone. I never like to refer to myself as an expert, because in the world of safeguarding, I think we all still learn, and every situation is there are so many nuances and perspectives and biases that actually we do better when we don't deal with safeguarding by ourselves. So please speak to your designated leads, speak to your peers, escalate it if you need to. There are informal channels of speaking to the police. Obviously, you have to be aware of your confidentiality thresholds, but informal ways of speaking to other agencies as well, to get advice on what you might be dealing with, so that you aren't dealing with it alone. So prevention strategies. We've talked a little bit about culture, and I think that speaks to the goal that I put on this slide, which perhaps isn't the most pretty of language, but it is about setting an expectation and an intention around what is around the behaviour and what's acceptable for you and your group, whether that's around clarity of acceptable behaviours, having a really normalised culture around reporting, and that not being about grasping or snitching, and that open dialogue around what's right and wrong, morals and values, whatever it might be, that there is this intentional goal that speaks to how you then proactively assess the environments, the policies and procedures that you have in place, the values or the behavioural expectations that are outlined at the beginning of sessions, and it's built into the fibre of your practice and your groups. That you are open and recognising and discussing and collaborating with other organisations or other people as relevant, and it isn't something that is dismissed, downplayed, kept quiet because of what might happen, but there is a commitment to working with others. And that there is appropriate education and training. whether that's for staff and volunteers, or whether it's for children and young people, and bringing it into their consciousness and awareness, appropriately so, what we consider to be appropriate, what isn't appropriate, and what could be abusive, and what that could result in for the person who is the perpetrator and the person who is the victim. But collaborating with young people in their learning and education process as well. I'm trying to just move on to the next slide. So I've rabbited on a bit too much today, unfortunately. There was maybe something for you to take away, so that we do have a couple of minutes for questions, but it's some action planning. So considering everything today, take away to commit to looking at these 4 questions. What you'll do to strengthen safeguarding in the context of child-on-child abuse. What will you achieve in the next month? What might get in the way of you achieving that? And what will you do to overcome it? And what else do you need to action and plan? And perhaps Grace can make sure this comes out to you, and you give yourself 5 minutes, 30 minutes this week, this side of Christmas, to just have a think about these 4 questions and building your safeguarding culture. This will come out with some resources. There is one from Farrow & Co, which is around addressing child-on-child abuse. It's a long document, but there are some useful, absolutely some useful resources to dig into there. And where else? Some of which we've talked to today, and there are a couple of other links in there for you to look at as well. And that's it. I don't have a question slide, unfortunately. So I will stop screen sharing.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions at this time for Chloe before we head off for the evening? Feel free to either come off mute or else in the chat if you're feeling shy.
I have a question, but I don't think it's an easy one to answer. It was going back to our parents' situation.
Yeah.
It's more where our parents are our volunteers, and we want to share learning and training, and potentially share learning from experiencing situations, because invariably you don't prepare for everything and then you implement it. It's finding that balance of sharing to people that you don't then, as I think Tracy said earlier, where everybody's friends, knows each other, end up with a community where by sharing the basics of something that might have happened, everybody's looking and going, oh, I wonder who that was, what was that? And it ends up becoming gossip and not, yeah, so that's sort of where I feel I get stuck sometimes, is that I'm nervous of sharing because it's a fear of gossip rather than learning amongst key people.
Yeah. And I think my answer also won't necessarily be the easiest or my response won't necessarily be the easiest ones to implement, but it would be around the expectations of the role of a volunteer, and that we don't expect it to turn into gossip. And if that were to happen, that not being a behaviour that you would expect to see in volunteers, and therefore either them changing that behaviour or not being able to continue in a volunteer role. And that's easy to say. I know that's a challenging thing to implement, but again, it's about holding the boundaries, the expectations, and there being, for want of a better word, because I can't think of anything else, but consequences if those behaviours aren't upheld in the way that you want to see them.
Chloe, can I just jump in as well? I think it's helpful to, if districts and groups are able to reflect on the scenarios that they've themselves encountered, but I can see why you don't always want to do that for exactly those reasons. The safeguarding scenarios that we've been using in our training, of which some do reflect on child-to-child abuse, are all drawn from life, but are divorced from any reference to any local context, and therefore are a really good tool in, because you can say these have all happened in Woodcraft groups. One of my tasks for the new year is to update those, because those have been, I mean, they're still relevant scenarios, but we've got other examples of stuff, particularly that's involved the online space and the kind of gap between the online space and people coming into groups, which are perhaps more indicative of some of the child-on-child issues and concerns that have come across my desk over the last couple of years. And maybe it's time that we put some more into updating that, so you've got a better toolkit to draw on to address this in your group, free of any kind of gossip about who might have been involved, if you see what I mean.
The guessing game. Thanks, Erin.
Any other questions at all?
It's not really a question, it's really or I suppose it is, how we get around this thing of it's the volunteers are usually parents, so you're dealing with your child's friends, or you're dealing with people that you've known since they were sort of 6 years old, and you know these kids really, really well, and you have relationships with them, and I think it's very difficult for people to see what's happening clearly without a really, really emotional response. It's very difficult for parents, I think, to be involved in that. I don't know what we do, because we haven't got enough volunteers to for the parents not to be involved, but
no, but perhaps that's something that you can be thinking about as you select who might be your local safeguarding leads, for example. And I know lots of groups, thrive on persuading parents that they really want to volunteer their time. Oftentimes have the conversation with parents about which age group they are best suited to work to. It might not be the one that their own little darlings are in.
But they very often have known the kids for years and years. They've been on camps with them since they were 6 or whatever, or they know their families. It's a very different relationship, I think, from, say, teachers have with the kids. And I think it makes the responses really difficult.
And I think there are two things in what you said for me. It's around, I'd have questions around recognizing and then questions about responding, and what the challenges are with both, and if it's more one than the other, because there would be different options to consider. So if it's about responding, how do you, excuse me, because I don't know the ins and outs of the model, but how do you partner with another group to offer an independent insight to help with the decision-making process, for example? Or when do you, if it becomes something like this, when do you kick it up the chain? Because impartiality is so challenged within the group. So if it's in that space, looking at some of those explorations, if it's around recognizing, for me, that's in your selection process, being open to these types of things and the awareness and their commitment to educating and supporting parents in their roles to understand that this is something that does happen. Every school should have an anti-bullying policy. I think legally now they should have one, because we know that it happens. So it's really about that informative education awareness process as well, I think. So it depends where your issue sits, and then solutionizing around that a little, I think.
Can I just jump in again, Chloe? Sorry. I think the other thing I'd say, you mentioned the point at which you kick it up the chain. Yes, we sit here as a safeguarding team, Grace and I and colleagues, taking reports and concerns that are shared with us, but actually a significant proportion of the conversations that we're having are very informal conversations designated with local safeguarding leads from groups, 9 times out of 10, they've got the right instinct about what needs to be done, and they just need to sense check what's done. Or sometimes I find myself as DSL saying, I will write to you and tell you that you need to do this thing that you've identified to me that you want to do, because you need that cover in order to persuade other parents that you lead a group with who happen to be your best mate in the school game, that there's that's the official line. I'm really happy to work with you to bring about the outcome that you need, and to discuss your gut instinct about what you might want to do or need to do in a situation, divorced from the logistical difficulties of persuading people who you might have known for 20 years that it's the right course of action, because we can help and we can offer you that support. But as I say, my experience is that the people who are embedded in the group, who know the personalities and know the issues involved best, usually know exactly what the right thing is to do. And that's one of the things that reassures me in my work. Often I'm getting people phoning up to say, we've done this, is that about right? Yes, it was exactly the right thing to do in the moment. Now let's deal with it and talk about how we move on. But we're always happy to have those conversations.
I have popped the safeguarding team email address in the chat for everyone, so please do take a note of that for future reference. I'll open the floor to one more question and then we'll wrap up. Has anyone got anything else to add? I'm just aware of timekeeping for everyone. It's probably dinner time for many people. If there aren't any other questions, then I will thank Chloe very, very much for being with us this evening. Super worthwhile session. And I'm sure everyone really appreciated the interaction as well, and sort of being able to chat and discuss and feedback. I always think that's really, really invaluable. So Chloe, thank you very much for coming and delivering this for us.
You're very welcome. Pleasure to be here. If any final questions do come through, please email them. I'm happy to work with Owen, Grace, and get any other answers out to you. But collaborate, discuss. It really is. It's a process, not just a set of actions for you. And thanks for being here on a Tuesday evening. Tuesday? I think we're Tuesday evening.
Perfect. Well, thank you, everyone. And this actually concludes our programme of volunteer training in the calendar as it stands for the year. So thank you very much for attending. It was a great turnout for the last event of the year. So yeah, have a wonderful Christmas and a new year. And we'll see you with a new programme in January.